Hello.
What's up?
Hello.
Yeah, should have warned you. There's 5 of us,
Nice to actually properly meet you, even if over Zoom.
right? It's sort of become the mode of operation for. It's like nice to meet you, kind of.
Yeah. Hey, I want to say just off the bat, I'm hugely impressed by the fact that you've pulled this off. No, you should be totally proud of what you've done here. And obviously at least for this particular interview, it's early days.
Mhm.
But yeah, congratulations, man. In all seriousness, I've used this kind of summer festival that you guys have put together as an example in conversations with friends and colleagues about what is possible now that frankly wouldn't have been possible 3 months ago, right? And to me, that's really exciting. Like I've given guest lectures in Santa Barbara, and next week I'm doing a thing in Germany, and I'm teaching a guy at Oberlin, and I literally have never left this chair. And I think that's really, I don't know, it's kind of exciting.
This was something that Trevor said. We emailing back and forth, and he said, "Why doesn't everybody just call brilliant composers? Like, why don't we just talk more? This is a great excuse to do this."
Yeah, I totally agree. So yeah, thanks. And as I say, like I've used this as a model for something that we're going to try and do in our teaching over the next year. Just ask whoever the hell we want to ask.
Right, exactly. and thank you for being a part of it. It's really cool.
Seriously, it's my pleasure.
We've had a lot of fun digging into your work and your writings, and really taking some. Quarantine's been a great excuse to really focus on learning new composers, people that we don't always hear in America, and really get a chance to flesh out what they're about, what the music's about.
Cool.
So it's been really cool. We've really enjoyed that.
Great.
I'm trying to imagine modeling for a program like you run at Huddersfield. Modeling the amount of research you do in a virtual space it's a whole other task. It's a whole other administrative issue.
Yeah.
And no, right? It's all of our responsibilities. But what's nice with new music, right, is that we've been forced to be adaptable for so long to every update, every technological advancement, that it's just sort of second nature for the community to figure out the problem.
This opens a huge can of worms, but I mean we've been having a conversation as a staff now for about 1.5 years about the nature of new music and where we see new music and its relationship with the world, and really trying to deeply interrogate why we do what we do, and why we do it where we do it. We ran a whole series of seminars this last year around new music and social change. And as it happens, like I think somehow even the sort of pandemic issues, and certainly the stuff that's happened in the US over the last week, all of a sudden those issues are even more prevalent. And I think some of the things that we were thinking about around the nature of concerts and the way in which kind of international travel operates, and like all of a sudden the fact that Zoom has become this totally ubiquitous thing has actually helped accelerate some of the ideas that we were having. They're no longer abstract, right? It's now as you say, like you're kind of forced into this place of inventing a new way of behaving.
Yeah, what's been going on in our country, at least for the last week, where we are, has been it's been hard at times to get back together on Zoom and talk about music, right? It sort of feels like we're not focusing on the right thing, but we also recognize that's what we do, and it is and is meant to be a very social art, and so we know that we hold a lot of not a lot of power, but a lot of sway through music. You've been working really hard over at Huddersfield with the whole like 50-50 gender divide. Yeah. I'm curious to know how everything that's going on in the US has influenced how you guys are thinking about diversity, about the social political role of music, of new music especially.
Yeah, I mean that's a hard thing to answer. So maybe I'll take it in a couple of different pieces. So the gender thing, first of all, what I want to say is I don't see myself as being a leader on that front by any stretch of the imagination. I have and had some incredibly good colleagues who, it's not to say that they've kind of forced my hand, but they've provided the leadership. So people like Lisa Lim, who I don't work with anymore, but Lisa has obviously been a really strong leader on that front. And then Liz Dobson, who is one of the co-founders of the Yorkshire Sound Women Network and has been I don't know, just a brilliant friend and model, and has done unbelievably inspirational work. And then Lisa Colton, who's a very close friend of mine, who was for a while the head of our research center that deals with questions around music and gender and identity. And Liz's work in particular, I mean, Liz, I saw, this is maybe something you've seen at some point on YouTube. There's a really great video of one of the workshops that they do periodically with young girls doing soldering. So they make a little noise toy from scratch, and the video, there's a moment where you see this probably, I don't know, 11-year-old girl who gets her toy to work for the first time, and her face lights up, and she says, literally, I feel like I could change the world. And I've watched that thing 20 times, 50 times, and I've never once managed to get through it without crying. And so, like, I just want to say flat out, what I'm doing on that front is simply activating work that other people have done first. And I feel like I have a certain sense of responsibility. I guess I'm quite lucky, and we are quite lucky at Huddersfield, that we have a platform, right? There's a network, we have friends in the field, we have institutional connections in industry, and I feel a really strong responsibility to do something with that platform, right? We have a stage, so what do we want to say on that stage? The second part of the question around diversity in general, and I think race in particular, is much harder for me to answer. So we did, as I said, this series on new music and social change at Sciarrino, and one of the recurring themes in all of our conversations was that was an area where our field really sucks, and it continues to suck. And I mean, you saw that in the the kind of black screens of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter posts, on Instagram or Twitter or whatever else, and people quite rightly responding to institutions mostly coming out of the Western art music tradition, and and then also some galleries and whatever else, saying, okay, great, do something about it, right? The solidarity is lovely. Now, show us the composition of your board of directors, or show us, who are you programming? And that's a place where we are still, as a field, way, way behind. What do we do about that? I mean, I think that's, as I said, the kind of conversation that we're having at Huddersfield at the moment, and across a lot of our partner institutions. I mean, this is just the very beginning of an answer. I'd have to spend a couple hours talking about this, but the short version is, I think in the music world in particular, and in the art world in general, often our approach to these kinds of issues of representation or diversity has been to do a kind of half-assed shitty job of saying, like, well, what if we did a kind of mediocre version of the thing that you like? Yeah, and will you come to our stuff then? And it's that approach that I think is misguided. I think the work has to be totally built from scratch, new, not trying to do something that's sort of like the communities that you're trying to reach. It has to come out of those communities in really earnest collaborative relationships. So the best model for that I've seen so far is here in Huddersfield, with HCMF, the Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival. They have a new program called the Young Curators Program, where they have funded, I think it's 6 young curators who are kind of representing various communities and areas of activity, either kind of ethnic backgrounds or particular kind of racial backgrounds, and building new work that's being driven by those curators, giving them funding, giving them infrastructure, giving them a platform, giving them a, helping build audiences, rather than trying to either bring new music in its current form someplace else, or try and bring music from another scene or another kind of discipline into the infrastructure of new music. It just needs to be something totally different. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer, but it's a very complicated question.
It's an excellent answer. And the point that's been kind of eye-roll worthy for me has been everybody saying, oh, here's music as a healing art. It's like, no, music has its own healing to do. Like we've got our own issues to sort out right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I kind of want to like hold this up and ask you guys the question in response, because you're at least a good generation younger than I am. Yeah, I think I can say this. The Run the Jewels record that came out yesterday was released early, and I can't stop listening to it. I'm on my like 5th go around, and I love it. And I listened. I think it was after listening to it the second time. My wife, who's an amazing singer and works quite a lot in the new music world, and I walked into the kitchen and we were cooking dinner together, and I said, "Fuck new music." And I just like, I had this sense like, how can you make new music in the way that we often think about new music? How can you make that now? Like, if you could make something that sounds like that RTJ4 record, you should, like, that feels to me way more powerful and way more relevant than a lot of what's happening in the new music world. And that's a very complicated issue, but I don't know, like, I think it is an important issue for you guys to deal with, right? I'm looking at the list of composers who you're interviewing and who you're talking to across the summer, and a lot of it's pretty European. It comes from a very particular kind of tradition, and there's a very long and important history that's kind of tied in with the language of music making.
It's a dialogue we're definitely having now, is like how complicit are we in that lineage, in just the simple continuation, the easy continuation of that lineage, rather than really confronting it and asking it questions, right? And sort of questioning its role in the world right now and in racial tension, and what we can do, not just to say, can we find composers who fit a racial background that write music like we like it, but how can we really upend that dialogue and say it's not just our responsibility to keep the same music with some different colors of composers, but can we get different musics, different representations, and really open that canister up to fully acclimate to all different types of voices.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear that. And sitting at the very back of that conversation for me, and this is something that I've been thinking through and dealing with a lot in my own work over the last 5 or 6 years, is fundamentally music is expressive and personal, right? And in your opening question around issues of gender and indeed issues of race and diversity in general, what you want is opportunities for people to be expressive, and what you want is something which is earnest and heartfelt and important. It is to our benefit to have voices that make expressive noises that haven't been heard before. Like, that's the thing that makes art exciting, at least to me.
I was in New York a couple months ago before all of this happened, and saw an incredible production of a dance piece by a South African dance company called Requiem for a Bells Bolero. And in it, there are 4 like beatboxer singers from the South African music making tradition, and it's all staged in a graveyard. And it's Requiem for loss, but like fragments of bolero are woven through this traditional South African music making, and all of a sudden you put that French simple like white bread music in this context, and it's unrecognizable, and it carries a different emotional weight than just an orchestrational study does. It's so powerful.
Interesting.
And I thought to myself, right, this is the path, right? It's not just, again, it's not like this is exemplary of what we need to do. It's not just say this exists in one place and there's a new place. We have to find how to transition. We have to find not just to cut the divide and say, all right, like none of that's worth it. How do we recontextualize, reframe that, and reimagine that now with what we know?
Yeah, I could buy that.
Flipping to a more musical dialogue, one of the things we've all sort of agreed on is that, in quarantine, time has sort of been out of whack. Right? The temporal space is sort of upended, which I was sort of curious from your perspective, because your music is, like you've sort of said, pitches out the window for you now. It's a consideration of time. Music is a temporal art. And we're in a really strange temporal space. I was curious about your reflection, having done all the temporal work that you have with music.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's been really apparent for me, I don't know what your experience has been like, but for me, there's this really fascinating phenomenon during the strictest portion of the lockdown in particular, where days seemed to kind of go on forever, but weeks would disappear in an instant. And like the fact that the last 3 months, in some ways, just has gone by really quickly, like very strangely quickly. And I think, I mean, this is something that I've been kind of teasing out a little bit in conversations with other people, and seem to be coming to some kind of conclusion that a lot of that has to do with an absence of any certainty about future, and that somehow is kind of reflecting backwards, that we're finding, I mean, it's changing a little bit over the last couple of weeks, I guess, as things start to open up and elements of normality start to return, much to my chagrin, frankly. Well, here, I mean, that's a whole nother conversation, but I mean, the situation in the UK is appalling. But it's really difficult to have any sense of where we're going to be in a month, even just the uncertainty. And that's still the case. And in my work and my wife's work, where so much of our activity is international, our ability to plan and figure out what the next project is going to be, or where it's going to be, or when it's going to be, is really difficult. So yeah, there is a very strange kind of collapsing that I think is part of what is causing this strange temporality, which is both very, very slow and really rapid. And I think some of that is also the strange repetition. I don't know, again, what your experience has been like, but my days for most of the last 3 months have been exactly the same. I try to kind of alter when I go for my run, if I go in the afternoon or if I go, in the early evening or whatever. But the content of the day is very similar and way more repetitive than my normal kind of day-to-day life. And a lot of that's about people, right? The kinds of excitement that you get from interacting with other human beings. Even those kinds of things are happening now in this kind of staged space. So even like, this is nice. I'm seeing 5 faces that I've never met before, and we're having an interaction that we haven't had before. But also I'm interacting with the screen and with the software in a way that, and in this room in a way that's very familiar now. You posed this question in the premise of, given the kind of my interest in, well, I don't know, it isn't so much just a question of time, but questions around kind of meter and strange temporalities. Yeah, I haven't yet figured out what this is all going to mean for my work. I have found it very difficult to make things, and I think that goes together. I can't quite figure out how musical materials or musical shapes should play out at the moment. I'm finding it really difficult.
I love that phrase, musical shapes, right? This whole idea of music as a geometry, music as a 3-dimensional object that we sort of examine from different sides, tying in with your thoughts on our time now, right? That we're sort of stuck in these cycles where the moments go by really slowly, but without a futurity, the weeks seem to just pass with a blink of an eye. It reminds me of your metaphor in non-geometric, with this whole idea of cyclers, right? From afar, it's just this mellifluous kind of slow-moving mass, but up close, there's all these different temporalities going on. This shape of an object, this shape of a musical material, it changes with those temporalities. So it has to be hard, as we're experiencing so many different ones, to create new shapes, to create when we can't really see the one that we're in now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really astute observation, and that might also have something to do with why I'm particularly struggling to make the kind of music that I would normally want to make, because it just has nothing to do with my daily experience, right? It has nothing to do with the normal, kind of normal 21st century life and its speed and its complexity. Now, I will say that has changed in the last week, right? The shift from what's happening in the US, I found, like, over the last few days, I have really wanted to make sound, really for the first time in 3 months. I mostly want to make pretty horrible sound. I'm totally serious. I want to make totally just fucked up, nasty noises at the moment. So I'm going to.
One of the things we were talking about was how you account for some of the unpredictableness of the simultaneous application of layers. You know, it's at a certain point, there's no really predicting or identifying on an instrument or a voice which sound, which multiphonic, which weird scraping noise is going to come out on whose instrument, whose embouchure, whose reed. Because you know, in certain parameters, your music is so specific about the sound that you make, and other times there are noises that are going to come out that aren't always predictable.
Yeah, I mean, so it's not so much that I account for that; it's that, you know, that is what the work revels in, right? I mean, that those kinds of unpredictabilities are really important to the work. I've talked about this in other circumstances, so, you know, kind of forgive me if I'm repeating myself a bit. But one of the things that's been really exciting and very interesting for me in the work, say over the last really, I guess, over the last decade. So once the kind of colored notation starts to come in, and some, you know, kind of highly specific, but nevertheless slightly ambiguous, intentionally ambiguous tablature notations, you know, around movement. One of the things that's really interesting in working with players and also working with singers, working through that notation, is that often things that start as really practical kind of objective instructions, move your hand here, move the bow here, do X with your, you know, with your tongue or larynx or whatever. So it starts to feel like this really kind of procedural activity. But the moment something cool comes out, even if that's really unexpected, like you move in a particular kind of way and it creates an interesting sound, I've watched as players then the notation goes back into being a much more kind of traditional notational role, where it's like being an interpreter in the way that you would learn to be an interpreter in a more conventional historical setting, right? You have an imagined version of what might come out from what's on the page, and you try and replicate that.
Mm-hmm.
I have a really specific memory of Kevin McFarland in the Jack Quartet with this kind of moment in a rehearsal where it was like, you know, doing something, it's like, oh, cool, that's awesome. And then you could see in all of the other performances that a lot of what he was trying to do was replicate this slightly unpredictable, but nevertheless kind of cool sound that came out. So I mean, that is to say, there is this element which is really unpredictable, but there's this second kind of layer that happens in the performance process where I think probably instinctively performers try and regain some level of control over that unpredictability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. We hear the sound that we love, and all of a sudden, what was unpredictable is all of a sudden the goal, right? It becomes like, I know that sound can be created. I can't quite figure out how I did it the first time, but now I got to reapply that same knowledge into the notation and make it again.
Yeah, I mean, and that's true even in really simple kinds of circumstances. I'm thinking about like really, really delicate, quiet touch on the piano, right? Mm. That like extraordinarily delicate, you know, 4 Ps, kind of just the perfect tone and the perfect weight and the perfect dynamic. And, you know, like, it's one of those things where, you know, you can do it in the practice room 50 times, and you know, when you're really on it, you can probably do it again and again, and then you do it in the gig and it's like, I missed it, you know, I did not. And that, you know, that tension is so much a part of, I think, why I mean, it's one of the things that I love about music making, right? That tension, that kind of magnetism of the gap between what you want it to be and what it can be. For me, that's fundamental to why I'm a composer, that gap is always present, and I love that.
As we were sort of examining some of your scores in the week before this, and talking about, as performers, right, how do you engage with something that at first glance looks so dense? Mm-hmm. And one of the things we were curious about was, where do you start with some of these layers, right? When there's so much information to compact into what needs to be in Western notation, a single system, or 4 systems in one stave, how do you start?
Yeah, well, that's changed a bit in more recent work. I'm kind of reintegrating some of the things that I was doing 10 and 20 years ago into how I'm working at the moment, after having done some things a bit differently for a while, as an experiment. Yeah, I mean, I watched your interview with Tim Rutherford Johnson, and my ears were burning a bit for part of it, and I loved his memory of looking at the sketches for the second string quartet. And actually, I mean, I can sort of answer the question by extending his answer to your question from however many weeks ago it was that you interviewed him. What I'm often doing, and in fact, this is now kind of true again with these more recent works, is I work very much from back to front. So I think about this as being, I guess the closest analogy would be like either kind of being a painter, right? And thinking about depth, and like something really simple, like if you were to paint, very traditional landscape painting, part of what you're doing at the very beginning is thinking about even something really simple, like where's the horizon, and how distant is the sun, and what does that mean for what the clouds are going to look like, and what does that mean for the kind of perspective that you're going to have, and how big foreground elements are going to be. And then you're kind of working in layers to get towards something which is more and more and more precise and more detailed and more on the surface. So that's kind of one way of thinking about that. I'm working often from kind of vague or hazy into specific, and I tend to do that across the entire piece at once. So I tend to make whole layers of decisions. So a lot of that sense of stacking is a stacking, but it's a stacking in this dimension rather than like putting on top of. And I think notationally, I think we often think about it as being a kind of superimposition, which isn't quite right. And I imagine, like, as you start to unravel some of the details, you start to see that it's more about this kind of web of networks. The other way that I often think about it is from a kind of architectural standpoint. So you could imagine, I love this constant, it isn't so much back and forth because they're highly contingent, right? So you have sketching or design, which is about, let's say, how a building or a space looks, but you also have that same kind of thinking about how a space feels. How does it, what is the experience of moving through that space, which is also about function. It's about, why you might go down a corridor or enter a door. And then that has these really strong implications on super local level details, like where do the outlets go, and where do you put the switch, and which way should the door open? And those decisions go back and forth, right? So you can decide, I need a plug in a different place, which means, or a faucet in a different place. That means the water main needs to come from this other place, which means the building needs to be shifted this way. And so I'm often doing that kind of thinking, which is not so much about, let's say, large to small, but about global versus local function. Sort of broad kinds of movements versus very specific kind of intentions of gesture.
What's interesting about that, as from a performer's perspective, right, is that how that works musically also applies physically. Right? We, as performers, we enter that space, we enter that room with sort of preconceptions of our body, of our instrument, of how it works, how we navigate it. And then we have to confront those decisions like through the course of learning the piece, right? I need to do this here with my body to get this transition right, which means that relates to something later, and I'm going to have to do something similar or different to get a different sound, right? There's a very physical, corporeal element of performing your work that matches the musical nature of it.
This is especially important for me being a percussionist. Just like literally most of my time at the beginning of a process is how do I build the setup to work to how I need it.
Yeah. I mean that's such a unique art form in the percussion world. I love that. Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything to say in response to that, because I mean, that's exactly right. The only thing I will say is I don't think that's in any way unique to the kind of approach that I take. And the best example I can think of is, have you ever seen the Barenboim masterclasses on the Beethoven piano sonatas? I mean, they're with like absolute world-class players. It's like Paul Lewis and Lang Lang and stuff when they were reasonably young, and they're exceptional. And all of it is about that kind of thinking. Or there's a great thing with him, with Robin Tiziati, a kind of conducting masterclass at, I think, the Royal College of Music. And it's exactly the same thing, like these really specific, very local level decisions that are like in the Piano Sonata videos, like about like voicing of chords and, you know, the weight in particular registers, which is in especially for Barenboim, totally about structure. It's about what's going to happen, like in some cases, like half an hour from now. You know, like how does this octave have to sound in this register in order for this other moment to be as important as it has to be? I love that.
And that's the privilege of a performer, right? Is to really get to enter those spaces, because we know that composers think through all those details, right? We know that in the process, that's
no, we don't. I mean, yeah. Some of that logic is present, but it can't live with that same level of intentionality that you can bring to it. That's a totally different kind of gift. That you can do that on the fly. You can guide people's listening to make those things that are otherwise present come to the foreground.
Then that makes me want to ask you your relationship, at least, or your thoughts on the relationship between this sort of structural conception of perception, as well as just the role of intuition of a composer, where the composer intuits, you know, as their sort of musical nature leads, compared to the very structural foundational work of writing.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll go back to the setup around Tim's answer, because and actually that's maybe to kind of finish the answer that I started a little earlier, that what I do in the sketching process, so in that kind of back to front, it isn't so much a kind of clarification, and it isn't so much about detail, and it isn't so much about layering. What really is happening in all of that sketching process, what the function is very much about intuition. In your question, I never, since it's been about 20 years, so roughly 2001 or so. Since that point, I've never done any sketching which establishes what's going to happen in a piece. I'm always sketching in a way which is about creating available windows of opportunity from which I select what's actually going to happen. So I'm always making these things which are, it's almost like a kind of iris, which is opening and closing, you know, kind of across time in real time. And that's designed so that at any given moment, as I'm writing, I'm working in a really kind of open and very free, very improvisatory kind of way, responding to whatever narrow window of opportunity I've provided for myself. So, and that, for me, that's a really important distinction. So, you know, like in terms of formal design and intuition, often what's happening in my work, in my sketching process, is I'm thinking about trajectories, I'm thinking about phrases, I'm thinking about the way that phrases link to other elements in the piece. And then at the very moment that I, you know, put the, you know, well, I was gonna say the pen to the page, but these days it's, you know, it's a digital pencil. You know, the moment that I'm actually at that point where I'm making the decision, it's really free. And so I don't know, it's almost like I've always been an athlete, and I love sports, and I think it's kind of similar. So like you think about sort of intentionality and intuition in sports, and the distinction between, I don't know, like I never played basketball, but like in basketball or football, where you have your kind of football, where you have, it's my kind of football too, I'm a Cowboys fan, where you have kind of set plays, but so much of the sport is around the improvisation that happens against those set plays, what you do when it breaks down. And I think a lot of my approach to kind of compositional strategy is like that as well, like giving yourself this kind of intention, you know, an idea about, I mean, I played soccer growing up, like a particular kind of thing that you're doing on whatever, on some set piece, on a corner kick. But so much of it is then about, I don't know.
Once the ball enters the air, everything's up for grabs. Like as soon as that trajectory takes off, it's anybody's guess.
Yeah. Well, but and also you're responding to other human beings. Mm-hmm. You know, like you're interacting with other people, all doing the same thing at the same time. They're also inventing and reacting.
first off, the sports metaphors are awesome. I don't know another composer who can link this music to sports, and it's incredible.
I know at least one more person, and that's my former student Ray Evanoff, who's really good at talking about the relationship between art and sports.
It's amazing.
His writings about sports are great.
You mentioned it earlier, sort of like talking about your own experiments in the course of your career. This is something that Robbie brought up. This idea of that you posed between the difference of a composer of experimental music and an experimental composer. I just sort of wanted to throw that at you and ask you to talk more on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, that's a really hard thing for me to answer at the moment. I mean, when there's the article presentation, which I gather you've read, where talked about that fairly directly, and that is now maybe 10 years old, not quite 10 years old. I don't remember when that happened, but I think it's like somewhere between 2010 and 2012, something like that. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I knew exactly what I meant. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I knew exactly what I was trying to do, and that's not the case at the moment. Oh, I mean, that's a very difficult thing to talk about. Let me do my best to do a kind of short version of it. I guess the most important sort of starting point for me is that I'm really aware that my work and, let's say, my training really comes very strongly out of the American experimental tradition. Michael Pizarro was my first teacher when I was a freshman at Northwestern 100 years ago. And the repertoire that was really important to me, like a lot of what I do comes out of the legacy of Cage, and really, kind of back through Ives, and like there's something about what I do that has a really strong grounding, and not just kind of in experimentation in general, but really out of that very particular kind of tradition. And a big part of that is about embedding the practice of experimentation into the practice of composition and into the work itself. Yeah, that's always been really important to what I do. That's shifted in some important ways in the last, maybe in the last 5 or 6 years. Some of that is because I'm a lot older. I've said before, like, I'm kind of in this weird period where I'm starting to make middle period music. I'm 43 years old. I'm middle-aged. I'm losing my hair. My eyes are going bad, and my priorities are different. But in particular, one of the things that I've really had to confront as a composer is that I spent about a decade, maybe a little bit more, in a position where every new piece was being driven by some kind of invention, a new way of thinking about instruments, a new way of thinking about notation, a new way of thinking about rhythm, a new way of organizing form. And I was constantly doing that. In every piece, I kept kind of upping the ante for states of novelty in that approach. I'm very proud of that work. I stand behind that work. But it also meant that I was never really in a position where I was getting better at working with those materials. And so the analogy that I've been using recently is that a lot of that work up until, kind of 2013, 14 or so, was about building a vocabulary. Yeah. And so I built this vocabulary, and now I really feel a responsibility to build a more sophisticated syntax, a more sophisticated grammar, that I can work with those materials. And, and that's fundamentally for me about what the next level of expressivity can be with my work. And I kind of like, my sense is, looking back across my career so far, is I sometimes got it right, but I think I probably got it right by a bit of luck. Like there are a couple of pieces. I think the voice piece that I think that's a place where it kind of works. But there are also a bunch of places where I know it doesn't work in the way that I wanted it to work. And so at the moment, I'm really working through different ways of imagining materials, different ways of working in terms of how I start a piece, how I imagine what a piece might become, that are probably less experimental in their practice. I'm working towards something that's closer to mastery, and that's why I joke about the sort of middle period approach, because that's not uncommon for composers, where you spend the first period of your career fucking shit up. And then you have to then you've got to deal with the mess that you've made. And then you're old and you can fuck shit up again. I'm not there yet. I've got another 20 years. I have to earn the next phase. So
in thinking about fucking shit up in the future, is there a work, a piece, an ensemble that you're just you're sort of withholding from yourself until the point that you feel you've mastered the grammar, the syntax, and you say, I'm dying to write this piece, but not yet?
No. No. And that's a really interesting question. I've never thought about that. Maybe I thought like that when I was a kid about kind of the idea of being the composer, but I don't know. I've been immensely lucky in that, I have a number of really close friends and colleagues who are these kind of partners in crime. I mean, like this joke around fucking shit up, right? That is the thing. Like when we go on stage for Elysian gigs, that is the last thing that people say before they walk on stage. It's, let's go fuck some shit up, right? And no, I'm not. I promise I'm not making that up. That's very true, and I hope I'm not giving away a industry secret or anything. But there's a sense of kind of partnership and camaraderie and risk, and so I can't imagine dreaming of something beyond what we've been able to dream up. It's always a kind of gift to even be a part of it. I guess the one thing is. Large ensembles, I have no idea what I would do with that, but I think probably in my case it's the other way around. I think that's something I could imagine other people wanting to see what I might do with those resources, but it's at the moment it scares the heck out of me. So it isn't my dream, but it could be interesting.
You remind me of something that Haya talked about, this idea of guerrilla warfare of contemporary musicians, right? All of us underground fighting for the same cause to fuck shit up.
Yeah.
That was, I think she put it in more metaphorical. That was the general consensus of the idea. I can't say thank you enough for this. I have one last sort of inquiry for you. Since it's been so prevalent in our view and our getting to know you in the tiny square of you that we get to look at, I'm curious if there's a book behind you that you've thought most about in the last couple months in lockdown that you're reflecting on more now, or that stands out on your shelf?
From up here, no. We've got. Actually, it was very funny in watching your interview with Tim Rutherford Johnson. His two black Billy bookshelves in the background is exactly what we have downstairs in the living room. No, I mean not really. I've been listening a lot over the last 3 months. I've been reading, but I've mostly been, I reread some old Anthony Bourdain books, which I really enjoyed. There was something about the kind of, I don't know, his deep generosity and kind of curiosity about humanity, which I found really comforting, especially in the early days of the lockdown. But I've been listening to a lot of kind of standard repertoire classical music. Between my wife and I, we've gone through 2 months of the free Berlin Digital Concert Hall, and I've really enjoyed that. I've enjoyed watching really high quality performances of Bruckner. That's been kind of where my brain has been for long stretches of lockdown, and then as I said, then yesterday the Run the Jewels record came out, and that's where I am now.
Bruckner and Run the Jewels, we'll put those in the playlist that goes along with.
I'd be perfectly happy with that.
Well, Aaron, thank you for this time. Thank you for the generosity of your words and for sharing all this with us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the rest of the festival all the way through the summer. Really exciting stuff.
Well, thank you again. It's been seriously our pleasure. This is awesome.
Same here. Really nice to meet you all, and good luck with the rest of the summer.
Thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.
See you soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for tuning into this week's episode of Everything But the Kitchen Sink. We hope you enjoyed it.
If you'd like to hear more, you can find all the episodes of our summer series on our YouTube channel and our website, alineaensemble.org.
Also, be sure to check out our social media profiles for more information and previews of upcoming episodes. Our handle is Alinéa Ensemble.
Please feel free to share today's episode with anybody you think might like it. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or comments.
Stay tuned for more episodes of Everything But the Kitchen Sink, released every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time.
And as always, we hope you are all safe and well. See you next time.
In my work, the idea is that the voice really becomes part of the overall sonic landscape. The idea is to kind of go against a certain hierarchy of voice above and instruments below, but really that they all exist within a kind of the same plateau.